Billionaire family mocks hotel maid until she grabbed the mech and opened a secret that left them dumbfounded. Hello, my wonderfully blessed family, and welcome. It's so good to have you here with me today. We've all been in situations where we feel judged, where people look at our clothes, our job, or our background and think they know everything about us. They put us in a box, and in that moment, we can feel completely and utterly invisible. He made the mistake of seeing only her uniform, not the woman wearing it. In 60 seconds, she would stand up, take the microphone, and prove that the woman scrubbing his floors was worth more than his entire bloodline. It's a painful feeling, one that can make you want to scream, to show them who you really are. And today's story is about a woman who did just that in the most spectacular way imaginable. He made the mistake of seeing only her uniform, not the woman wearing it. In 60 seconds, she would stand up, take the microphone, and prove that the woman scrubbing his floors was worth more than his entire bloodline. But this isn't just a story about revenge. It's a story about what happens after the masks come off, when two people from different worlds are forced to see the truth in each other. Have you ever felt completely invisible or been judged unfairly based on a first impression? How did it make you feel, and what did you wish you could say or do in that moment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories. The Grand Sequoia Hotel wasn't just a building. It was a testament to ambition, a palace of marble and gold leaf that scraped the New York City skyline. It smelled of money, a carefully curated blend of freesia, old leather, and the faint, crisp scent of freshly printed currency that seemed to emanate from the very walls. For the guests who glided across its polished floors, it was a symbol of arrival. For Debby Washington, it was the perfect place to disappear. Her world was one of quiet corridors and the soft, rhythmic hum of a service elevator. It was a world measured in folded towels and spotless surfaces. For 4 years, this had been her sanctuary. The dark blue housekeeping uniform, simple and functional, was more than just work attire. It was armor. It rendered her invisible, a ghost who polished the lives of the wealthy. And she cherished that invisibility. Her cart, a marvel of organization, moved with a silent, practiced grace. Each bottle of cleaner was aligned, each cloth folded into a perfect square. Today was the day of the Anderson Charity Gala, the hotel's most prestigious event of the year, and the entire building thrummed with a nervous, high-strung energy. But Debby's movements remained unhurried, deliberate. She ran a gloved finger along the top of a gilded picture frame in the hallway outside the grand ballroom. No dust. She permitted herself a small, tight smile of satisfaction. This was real. The smooth, cool glass under her fingertips, the tangible result of her labor. It was a feeling no stock portfolio or board meeting had ever given her. Inside the cart's small, locked compartment sat a worn, leather-bound copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. It was the only piece of her old life she allowed herself. Sometimes, on her break, she would sit in the quiet linen closet, the smell of bleach and clean cotton surrounding her, and read the lines. I am large. I contain multitudes. A bitter laugh would sometimes escape her then. She had once contained multitudes. Now, she just contained Debby, the maid, and it was, for the most part, enough. She straightened a velvet rope stand, her reflection looking back at her from the polished brass. The woman in the reflection had her features high cheekbones, deep brown eyes that held a universe of secrets, and a strong jaw. But the weariness around the eyes, the determined set of her mouth, the utter lack of adornment that was new. That was the mask. It had been forged in the fires of betrayal and loss, a story she had buried so deep she could sometimes forget it was there. A story worth $80 billion. The muffled thrum of the orchestra tuning up vibrated through the floorboards. Soon, this hallway would be flooded with jewels and egos. Soon, she would need to be gone, a phantom retreating to the concrete and steel arteries that were the hotel's backstage. She gave her cart one last check, the quiet efficiency of her routine a balm to the old wounds that sometimes pricked at her consciousness. Here, she was in control. Here, no one asked anything of her except a clean room. Here, no one looked at her and saw a number. They didn't look at her at all. And that was peace. 50 floors above, in the sprawling Anderson penthouse suite, peace was a foreign currency. Pascal Anderson stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, the whole of Central Park sprawling beneath him like a private garden. The view was worth $100 million, but he saw none of it. His gaze was fixed on his own reflection, a man tailored into a perfect, suffocating tuxedo. He loosened his bow tie for the third time, the silk feeling like a leash against his throat. "Pascal, for heaven's sake, stop fidgeting." A voice like splintering ice cut through the room. His mother, Beatrice Anderson, glided in, a column of emerald silk and diamonds. Her silver hair was sculpted into a helmet of perfection, and her eyes, the same sharp blue as his, performed a swift, brutal inventory of his appearance. "You look like a nervous groom. This is our night. The Anderson Gala is the cornerstone of the fall social season. It requires a host, not a fidgeter." "I'm fine, Mother," he said, his voice tight. He turned from the window, forcing a smile that felt like cracking plaster. "Just ensuring everything is perfect." "Perfect is my job," she corrected him, adjusting his bow tie with sharp, decisive tugs. Her fingers were cold. "Your job is to be charming, to remind these people why the Anderson name means something, especially with the new technology fund launching next quarter. We need confidence. We need strength." "I know the speech," he said, a familiar weariness seeping into his bones. It was always a performance, and he was always the lead actor in a play he never auditioned for. His father, a titan of industry before his passing, had left him a legacy as heavy as a tombstone. Pascal was the CEO of Anderson Corp, a title that felt more like a sentence. His sister, Clara, wafted in, leaving a trail of overwhelmingly expensive perfume in her wake. She was holding up her phone, her brow furrowed in manufactured distress. Daddy would be turning in his grave if he saw the guest list this year. The Van Houtens brought their son, the one who invests in artisanal kombucha. She said the words as if they were a disease. Pascal ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up just enough to earn another disapproving glare from his mother. "It's a charity gala, Clara. We're supposed to be celebrating philanthropy, not gatekeeping the 1%. Philanthropy is the appetizer, darling," Beatrice said, picking an invisible piece of lint from his shoulder. "Legacy is the main course, and our legacy does not include kombucha. Now, both of you, smiles on. It's time to descend." As they walked toward the private elevator, Pascal's phone buzzed. It was a text from his oldest friend, a geology professor who had long since opted out of this gilded cage. "Still time to fake a heart attack and go bowling. Just saying." A genuine smile, small and fleeting, touched Pascal's lips. For a single, beautiful second, he imagined it. The satisfying crash of a bowling ball, the smell of stale beer, the easy laughter. a world away from the clinking of champagne glasses and the weight of a name he didn't earn. But then the elevator doors opened with a soft, expensive sigh, and the moment was gone. He straightened his shoulders, the charming, confident mask of Pascal Anderson, the billionaire scion, clicking into place. The descent felt like a fall, each floor taking him further from the man who wanted to go bowling and closer to the host his mother demanded. The elevator opened directly into the private reception area behind the grand ballroom stage. The low roar of the crowd was audible, a beast waiting to be fed. "Final check before we go out," Beatrice commanded, her eyes scanning the corridor. "Everything must be pristine." Clara, ever eager to please, pointed a manicured finger down the hall. "Mother, look!" "What is that?" Pascal followed her gaze. 100 feet away, a maid was on her hands and knees, wiping a small, almost invisible smudge from the marble floor. Her back was to them, her focus entirely on her task. She was a small, anonymous figure in a simple blue uniform. "Good heavens," Beatrice murmured, her lip curling in distaste. "Can't the staff be finished before the guests arrive? It's so untidy." They began to walk toward the main entrance, their path taking them directly past the kneeling woman. Pascal was distracted, his mind already running through the opening lines of his speech, the names he needed to remember, the hands he would have to shake. He barely registered her. She was just part of the scenery, a piece of the hotel's machinery. As they drew level, Debby finished her task. She gathered her cloth, her movements efficient and graceful. She was about to rise when the little trio of perfectly dressed predators came to a halt right beside her. Unaware, she remained on one knee, preparing to push herself up. Her world of quiet anonymity and his world of suffocating pressure were about to collide on a polished stretch of Italian marble, and the impact would be more powerful than either of them could ever imagine. The first sign of their approach wasn't sound, but scent. Cloud of expensive perfume, Beatrice's signature scent, a rare blend so potent it seemed to suck the oxygen from the air washed over Debby, sharp and invasive. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, anonymous smell of her cleaning supplies. Then came the shoes, entering her downcast field of vision. A pair of emerald green satin stilettos, a pair of glittering silver pumps, and a pair of gleaming black patent leather dress shoes. They stopped just inches from her worn, rubber-soled work shoes. Debby remained kneeling, her body tensing. Protocol was clear: be invisible, be silent, finish your work, and disappear. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, on the last faint trace of the smudge she'd just erased. The marble felt suddenly cold, its chill seeping through the thin fabric of her uniform trousers. "Honestly, Pascal, you need to have a word with the hotel manager." Beatrice's voice sliced the air, not lowered, but projected, as if Debby wasn't a person but a piece of furniture left carelessly in the hall. The five-star experience doesn't typically include watching the staff scour the floors moments before a gala. "She's probably just trying to get a peek at us," Claire added with a tinkling, malicious laugh. Can you blame her? It's not every day you get this close to $1 billion. It's probably the highlight of her year. Each word was a small, sharp stone thrown at the careful wall Debby had built around herself. Highlight of her year. The phrase echoed in the cavern of her mind. She thought of the G7 summits she'd attended with her father, of watching the sunrise from a private villa in Santorini, of the quiet satisfaction of closing a multi-million-dollar philanthropic grant that would build 3 new schools in Ghana. The bitter irony tasted like acid in her throat. She gripped the damp cleaning cloth in her hand, her knuckles turning white under the latex glove. Say nothing. Do nothing. It will pass. It always passes. Pascal shifted his weight. Debby could hear the impatient rustle of his tuxedo. He was the one she'd noticed before, in passing. The one with the haunted look in his eyes, when he thought no one was watching. For a foolish second, she thought he might be different. That he might murmur an apology, or guide his family away. "Mother, Claire, please," he began. And for that fraction of a second, a sliver of hope flickered within her. It was extinguished almost instantly. His tone wasn't one of defense, but of annoyance. She wasn't a person to be defended. She was a topic of conversation to be ended. He sighed, a sound of pure, unadulterated exasperation aimed at his mother, yet it was Debby who felt its impact. He didn't even look down at her. His gaze was fixed on the grand entrance to the ballroom, on the stage, on his future. She was a momentary, inconvenient obstacle in his peripheral vision. "Let's just go," he said, his voice clipped and cold. "Let's not concern ourselves with the help." He paused, and then delivered the final, careless blow, a line meant to placate his mother that would instead detonate a bomb in Debby's life. "Some people are just born to be on their knees." Silence. A profound, ringing silence that was louder than the orchestra, louder than the distant hum of the crowd. In that silence, 4 years of carefully constructed peace, of cherished anonymity, of self-imposed exile, didn't just crack. It vaporized. The words "born to be on their knees" did not just sting. They pierced through the uniform, through the flesh, and straight into the heart of the trauma she had been running from. She was suddenly back in another grand room, 4 years ago. She was on her knees then, too, begging the man she thought she loved, the man who had her father's trust not to do it. Pleading with him as he smiled that charming, empty smile and explained that his love had always been for her name, for her inheritance, for the Washington empire he was about to gut and sell for parts. He had looked down at her then, with that same casual, dismissive pity. "My darling," he'd said, "you were always so much more appealing when you weren't in charge." The memory, hot and sharp, fused with the present moment. The chill from the marble floor was suddenly gone, replaced by a searing heat that flooded her veins. It was the same dismissal, the same casual erasure of her humanity, the same assumption that her position defined her worth. Pascal had made a critical error. He hadn't just insulted a maid. He had, with 5 careless words, resurrected Debby Washington. Not the broken, hiding version, but the one who had sat at boardroom tables, the one who had negotiated with sharks, the one who understood that power wasn't just about money, it was about leverage. And in that instant, she had all the leverage in the world. Her breath, which she hadn't realized she was holding, came out in a slow, steady stream. The rage wasn't hot and messy. It was cold, crystalline. It brought with it a terrifying, exhilarating clarity. She could let them walk away. She could get up, retreat to her quiet corridors, and spend another 4 years hiding. Or she could burn their world to the ground. Her eyes, still looking at the floor, lifted slightly. They drifted past Pascal's immaculate shoes, past the velvet ropes, and to the side of the stage. To the podium. And on the podium, gleaming under a single, focused spotlight, was a microphone. "I contain multitudes," a line from her book whispered through her mind. For 4 years, she had tried to shrink herself to contain only one. The maid. The ghost. But the billionaire was still in there. The philanthropist. The betrayed fiancé. The grieving daughter. And right now, the avenger. Slowly, deliberately, she began to move. She peeled the latex gloves from her hands, finger by finger, and dropped them beside her damp cloth on the floor. A tiny, ceremonial shedding of her skin. Then she placed one hand flat on the floor and pushed herself up. Not with the tired deference of a servant, but with the coiled, measured grace of a predator. She rose to her full height, her posture straightening into something regal and unyielding. She didn't look at them. Not yet. She could feel their collective gaze on her, a mixture of confusion and irritation. They were still waiting for her to scurry away. Instead, she took a step. And another. Her worn, rubber-soled shoes made no sound on the marble floor as she walked past them. She didn't hurry. Each step was a drumbeat, a declaration. The air crackled around her. She could feel Pascal finally turn his head, his gaze following her, a flicker of unease finally penetrating his bubble of privilege. He saw Maid walking away from her cleaning supplies, but something was wrong. Her walk, the set of her shoulders, the chilling purpose in her stride, it didn't compute. She walked toward the podium, toward the light, toward the microphone. The orchestra was just finishing its final tuning, a crescendo of strings filling the air. It felt like a soundtrack building to a climax. Her climax. As she reached the small set of stairs leading to the stage, she finally allowed herself to glance back at them. Beatrice's face was a mask of haughty confusion. Claire's was one of petulant disbelief. But it was Pascal's expression that she would remember. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. He finally, truly saw her. Not as a uniform, not as the help, but as a woman with an agenda he could not begin to fathom. He saw the storm that was coming. He had made the biggest mistake of his life. He had told Debby Washington she was born to be on her knees. And now she was about to stand up and tell the whole world who he was. The ballroom was a sea of glittering diamonds and calculated smiles. 200 of the country's most powerful people, old money, new money, tech titans, and Wall Street sharks were suspended in that delicate moment before a gala truly begins. A symphony of polite laughter and the clinking of champagne flutes. They were all watching the stage, waiting for the polished, predictable charm of Pascal Anderson to officially welcome them. What they got, instead, was Debby Washington. She ascended the 3 short steps to the stage, the simple, dark blue fabric of her uniform, a stark and shocking contrast to the backdrop of velvet curtains and golden Anderson family crests. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Who was this? A staff member with a last-minute announcement? A union representative staging a protest? The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Debby reached the podium, her hands steady and sure, wrapped around the cool, solid microphone. She adjusted it upward to meet her height. The small metallic scrape was amplified throughout the cavernous room, a sound so alien in this setting that it commanded immediate, absolute silence. Every eye was on her. She looked out at the blur of faces, at the jewels that cost more than a family home, at the tailored suits that whispered of power. And then her gaze found them, standing frozen in the entryway. Beatrice's face was pale, her perfectly painted smile now a horrified grimace. Claire looked as if she'd been slapped. And Pascal. Pascal looked like a man watching his own execution. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, she held his entire world in the palm of her hand. She took a deep, centering breath, the smell of the stage lights, hot dust, and electricity filling her lungs. Then she spoke, her voice not loud, but clear and resonant, carrying to the furthest corners of the ballroom with the unwavering strength of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Good evening. The words were simple, yet they landed like thunder. Her voice was not that of a maid. It was cultured, confident, laced with an authority that was utterly at odds with her appearance. My name is Debby Ann Washington. A few polite, confused blinks. The name meant nothing to them. Yet, for the last 4 years, she continued, her voice gaining strength, I have had the distinct privilege of working here at the Grand Sequoia Hotel. I've cleaned your rooms, polished your silver, and carried out your trash. I have done my job quietly, and, I believe, with dignity. She let that hang in the air for a moment. She could feel the tension in the room coiling, a palpable thing. She saw Pascal take a half step forward, as if to intervene, but his mother's hand shot out, grabbing his arm with a grip of iron. Just moments ago, Debby said, her eyes finding Pascal's again, pinning him in place, your host for this evening, Mr. Pascal Anderson, alongside his mother and sister, shared an observation with me. As I was on my knees, cleaning a smudge from the floor to ensure this venue was perfect for them. For all of you, he suggested that some people are just born to be on their knees. A collective gasp went through the room. It was sharp, shocked. This was more than a protest. This was an accusation. A public shaming. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Eyes darted from Debby on the stage to the ashen-faced Andersons in the doorway. It's a powerful statement, Debby went on, her tone becoming dangerously calm. It speaks to a belief system, a worldview, the idea that some of us are inherently lesser, that our value is determined by our station, our uniform, our job title. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in, and I found myself wondering what, exactly, is the measure of a person's worth in a room like this? Is it your name? Your portfolio? The company you keep? She smiled, but it was a smile devoid of warmth. It was the smile of a hunter closing a trap. Let's test that theory. Mr. Anderson's family is worth, by most public estimates, a respectable $7 billion. A commendable achievement. Her eyes scanned the room. Many of you in this audience are millionaires. Some of you billionaires. You are, by all accounts, the masters of the universe. The crowd was utterly mesmerized, caught in the grip of a drama more compelling than any stock market fluctuation. My father, Debby said, her voice softening just a fraction, a touch of genuine emotion finally breaking through the icy control, was a man named Lovestory Washington. A flicker of recognition in the eyes of the older guests. The Titans. Lovestory Washington, the reclusive, almost mythical founder of Washington Global, a man who had built an empire from nothing and then vanished from the public eye decades ago. A ghost of finance. Before my father passed, she said, her voice now a blade, he built an empire. An empire of technology, logistics, and sustainable energy. An empire he left to his only child. She leaned closer to the microphone, her gaze sweeping across every stunned face, before finally, devastatingly, landing back on Pascal. So I'd like to correct the record on one small thing. My name is Debby Washington, and according to the last filing from my family's trust, the woman Mr. Anderson believes was born to be on her knees is currently worth $87 billion. The silence that followed was not silence. It was a physical force, a shockwave that buckled the collective consciousness of the room. Jaws literally dropped. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. The number, so absurd, so astronomical, hung in the air, shimmering and terrible. 87 billion. It was a figure that transcended wealth. It was a geopolitical force. Debbie's voice dropped to a near whisper, but it was the most powerful sound in the room. So, you see, my issue isn't that Mr. Anderson insulted a maid. It's that he and people like him are such profoundly poor judges of character and of value. She placed the microphone gently back in its cradle. She gave one last long look at Pascal, a look that conveyed not triumph, but a deep, sorrowful pity. Then she turned and walked off the stage with the same quiet dignity with which she had arrived, leaving behind a mushroom cloud of chaos. As she disappeared through a service door at the back of the stage, the ballroom erupted. The dam of polite society broke, and a tidal wave of frantic, excited chatter flooded the space. Phones were already out, thumbs flying across screens, spreading the story at the speed of light. The Anderson Gala had just become the epicenter of the biggest social scandal in a generation. Back in the entryway, Beatrice's face was a mottled mask of fury and humiliation. "Get her," she hissed at the hotel's security chief who had run over, his face panicked. "Stop her!" But Pascal didn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his mind a howling void. 87 billion. The number was meaningless. It was the look in her eyes that had undone him. The pity. She hadn't just exposed him, she had judged him and found him wanting. The shame was so profound it was physical, a burning weight in his chest. His careless, cruel words echoed back at him, now recast as the blunder of a foolish, arrogant child. He hadn't just kicked a dog, he had kicked a sleeping dragon. Debby didn't run. She walked. She navigated the familiar labyrinth of service corridors, her footsteps echoing in the stark, concrete passageways. The adrenaline that had propelled her onto the stage was fading, replaced by a hollow, trembling emptiness. The takedown, as spectacular as it had been, offered no real comfort. It was a sugar high, a momentary rush of power that did nothing to fill the profound loneliness that had been her constant companion for 4 years. She reached the staff locker room. It was empty, the rest of the evening staff already deployed. The metallic tang of old sweat and cheap disinfectant hung in the air. She sat on the hard wooden bench, the same bench where she had her lunch every day, and stared at the dented gray metal of her locker. The victory felt Pyrrhic. She had reclaimed her name, but in doing so, she had shattered her sanctuary. The invisibility she had cultivated so carefully was gone forever. By tomorrow, her face would be everywhere. The ghost was gone, and Debby Washington, the reclusive heiress, the stuff of legends, was back. And she had never felt more alone. The rage was gone, leaving behind only the cold, familiar ache of grief. Grief for her father. Grief for the life she had lost. Grief for the peace she had just willingly sacrificed on the altar of her pride. She had won. She had left them all dumbfounded. So why did it feel so much like a loss? She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, and buried her face in her hands. The cool, calm woman on the stage was gone. In her place was just Debby, sitting in a basement locker room, the weight of $87 billion once again settling on her shoulders like a shroud. The silence of the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the pandemonium she had unleashed 50 floors above. The fallout was just beginning, for the Andersons, and for her. And she had a terrible feeling that neither of them would escape the shrapnel. The Grand Sequoia Hotel, once a bastion of impenetrable luxury, had become a fortress under siege. Within an hour, the first satellite news vans arrived, their massive antennas rising like metallic vultures against the darkening Manhattan sky. Then came the reporters, a swarm of them, buzzing with an insatiable hunger for the story. They crowded the main entrance, their cameras flashing like strobe lights, their microphones thrust forward like weapons. The Anderson Gala was no longer a private event. It was a global spectacle. Inside, chaos reigned. Guests weren't leaving. They were clustered in frantic, gossiping knots, their phones held up like religious artifacts. The hotel's PR team was in a full-blown panic, their carefully crafted image of serene exclusivity shattered. The Andersons had been hustled away from the ballroom entrance by a phalanx of security, but the damage was done. They were no longer hosts. They were prisoners in their own gilded cage. Debby knew none of this. She remained in the quiet cocoon of the staff locker room, the storm raging far above her. She had changed out of her uniform, folding it with her usual precision and placing it in her locker. She was now in a simple pair of black trousers and a gray sweater, her civilian clothes, another form of invisibility. Her plan was simple: slip out the service exit at the back of the hotel, disappear into the anonymity of the city, and figure out what came next. Her life as a maid was over. But when she opened the heavy steel door to the rear alley, she was met with a scene of equal chaos. A dozen reporters, having anticipated this very move, surged forward. Camera flashes exploded in her face, blinding her. "Miss Washington, is it true? Debby, why were you working as a maid? What do you have to say to the Andersons? Is it true you're worth $87 billion? The questions were a barrage of noise, a physical assault. She recoiled, stumbling back into the corridor and slamming the heavy door shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. The lock clicked, and she leaned against the cool metal, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Trapped. The back was blocked. The front was a war zone. She was a captive in the one place she had once felt free. 50 floors up, in the penthouse suite, the air was thick with impotent rage. Beatrice was pacing like a caged panther, her emerald dress a slash of angry color against the muted tones of the suite. Clara was on the phone, her voice a high-pitched whine as she tried and failed to do damage control with a society columnist. Pascal stood by the window again, but this time he wasn't looking at his reflection. He was looking down at the street, at the flashing lights of the news vans that seemed to spell out his humiliation in Morse code. His mother's fury, his sister's hysterics, it was all just white noise. His mind was consumed by a single, obsessive thought. He had to find her. It wasn't about an apology, not yet. He wasn't noble enough for that. It was about something more primal, a need to understand. How could he have been so blind? What kind of a woman orchestrates her own disappearance for 4 years, only to reappear in such a blaze of glory? He had dismissed her, erased her from existence with a careless phrase, and she had responded by rewriting his reality. It was terrifying, and for reasons he couldn't begin to articulate, it was utterly compelling. "I'm going to find her," he said, his voice cutting through his mother's tirade. Beatrice stopped pacing and whirled on him. "You'll do no such thing. You will stay here. We will draft a statement. We will say she is mentally unstable, a disgruntled former employee with a history of delusions. We will crush her." Pascal looked at his mother, at the cold, reptilian fury in her eyes, and for the first time, he saw the ugliness of it without any filter. They weren't going to crush her. They were going to crush a lie, a fabrication designed to protect their own fragile pride. "No," he said, the words simple but firm. It was perhaps the first time in his adult life he had said it to her with such finality. "This was my mistake. My words. I'm going to fix it." "Fix it?" Clara shrieked, dropping her phone. "Pascal, She just detonated a nuclear bomb on our family name. You don't fix that. You retaliate." He ignored them. He walked out of the living area, grabbing a simple black jacket from the closet. He didn't take his private elevator. He took the staff elevator, the same one Debby had used countless times. The descent was different this time. It wasn't a fall from grace. It felt like a purposeful journey into a world he had only ever seen from above. He had no idea where he was going. The hotel was a city unto itself. But he had a gut feeling. She wouldn't be in the public spaces. She would be in the places she knew. The quiet places. The hidden places. He began to walk the service corridors, his expensive dress shoes echoing strangely on the bare concrete floors. He passed linen closets, engineering rooms, vast kitchens, now silent and gleaming under fluorescent lights. It was like seeing the hotel's soul, the machinery that made the fantasy on the upper floors possible. He was searching for a ghost. Debby had found a temporary refuge. The hotel's rooftop garden was closed for the season, a forgotten oasis of dormant rose bushes and terracotta pots shrouded in burlap. A winding staircase, meant only for maintenance staff, led up to it. Here, the air was cold and clean, and the sounds of the city below were a distant, muffled roar. The chaos felt a world away. She stood by the stone balustrade, looking out at the glittering tapestry of the city. She had once looked at this same view from boardrooms, seeing a kingdom of opportunities. Now, it just looked like a cage of a different kind. She heard a footstep on the gravel path behind her. She didn't startle. Somehow, she wasn't surprised. It felt inevitable, a final piece of the night's strange drama falling into place. She didn't turn around. "They're at the back entrance, too," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the fire it held on stage. "And the front. The hotel is surrounded. You're trapped here, just like me." Pascal stopped a few feet away from her. He saw her silhouette against the city lights, a solitary figure wrapped in a plain gray sweater. She seemed smaller now, without the righteous fury to magnify her. She just looked tired. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat. "How did you know it was me?" "Your shoes," she replied without turning. "They sound expensive and guilty." He flinched. The arrogance, the carefully constructed facade he wore, like a suit of armor, was gone. He felt raw, exposed. I came to..." He didn't know what he came to do. Apologize. Yell? Demand an explanation? All the words felt cheap, inadequate. Debby finally turned to face him. In the dim light of the cityscape, her face was a study in shadows. The weariness in her eyes was profound. "You came to what, Mr. Anderson? To finish the lecture? To offer me a job more suited to my station? Or maybe you just wanted a front row seat to see the full extent of the damage you caused." "The damage I caused?" He shot back, a spark of his old defensiveness flaring up. "You're the one who got on a stage and publicly assassinated my entire family." "Don't you dare," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. She took a step closer, and for the first time, he saw the real fire in her, up close. It was terrifying. "You drew first blood. You and your mother and your vapid sister, with your cruelty. You looked at a human being on her knees, and you stepped on her. That is the damage. That is the poison. I didn't assassinate you. I just held up a mirror." He had no response. She was right. The public humiliation was a consequence, not the cause. The root of it all was that moment in the hallway That thoughtless, unforgivable comment born of privilege and stress. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken accusations and the raw, jagged edges of their two shattered worlds. They were alone, 50 stories above the city, trapped in the fallout of a war that had started just hours ago. He was the arrogant billionaire. She was the secret heiress. But up here, in the cold night air, they were just two people, stripped of their titles and their armor, forced to confront the wreckage they had made of each other. Why? He finally asked, the single word, a plea. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the gala. It was about her. Why were you working as a maid? 4 years. Why? It was the one question she hadn't answered on stage. The one question that held the key to the entire mystery. She looked away from him, back at the city. A cold gust of wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a whisper, carried away by the wind. Because a name like Washington, a fortune like mine, it doesn't just buy you things, Mr. Anderson. It attracts monsters. And I was tired of feeding them. The vulnerability in that statement was so stark, so unexpected, it disarmed him completely. He had come looking for a fight, for an explanation, for some way to reclaim control. But instead, he found a crack in her armor, a glimpse of the wounded person hiding inside the avenging angel and the quiet maid. And in that moment, the dynamic between them shifted from adversaries to something else entirely, something far more complicated and far more dangerous. Pascal and Debby are now trapped together, forced to see past the roles they played. Have you ever been in a situation where you were forced to spend time with someone you had completely misjudged? What did you discover about them and about yourself when the initial impressions faded away? Share your experiences in the comments. The words hung in the cold air between them, fragile and heavy. It attracts monsters, and I was tired of feeding them. Pascal felt the last of his defensiveness crumble, replaced by a raw, uncomfortable curiosity. He had spent his life surrounded by people who chased wealth, who saw it as the ultimate prize. He had never considered it a curse, a form of bait. He looked at Debby, at the rigid line of her shoulders, and saw not an enemy, but a survivor. What monsters? He asked, his voice softer now, stripped of its earlier edge. It was no longer an interrogation. It was a genuine question. Debby wrapped her arms around herself, a subconscious gesture of self-protection. For a long moment, she didn't answer. She was wrestling with a ghost she'd kept buried for 4 years. Talking about it felt like a betrayal of the vow of silence she had made to herself, a reopening of a wound she had tried so hard to cauterize. But the silence in this garden, with this man who was, in a strange way, a part of her story now, felt different. It was a vacuum, demanding to be filled. You think your world is built on legacy and ambition, Sister Anderson began, her voice low and tight with memory. It's not. It's built on performance. Everyone is playing a role. The devoted wife, the brilliant CEO, the loving son. She glanced at him, her eyes sharp. The charming philanthropist. He had no answer to that. It was the unvarnished truth of his life. I was engaged once, she said, the words coming out clipped and brittle, as if they were pieces of glass. His name was Julian. He was perfect. Ivy League education, impeccable family, a smile that could disarm world leaders. My father adored him. I adored him. She walked over to a stone bench, the surface damp with dew, and sat down. She stared at her hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. They were no longer the hands of a maid, calloused and practical. They were just her hands. Julian wasn't interested in Washington Global, she continued. He said he loved me. He loved my passion for art, my terrible sense of humor, the way I read poetry aloud. He made me believe he saw me, the person, not the name. He wanted me to be in charge of the family's philanthropic foundation. He said I had the heart for it, and he would handle the tedious business side of things to protect me from it. It was a perfect partnership. Pascal remained standing, a silent witness. He could see the story unfolding before it was even told. It was a classic, cruel tale, one he'd seen variations of his whole life. But hearing it from her, seeing the pain etch new lines around her eyes, made it feel visceral and new. My father got sick. A fast, aggressive cancer. In the last few months, he was not himself. He signed over more and more control to Julian, trusting him completely. He made Julian the executor of his will and the primary signatory on the corporate accounts, all to lighten my load while I cared for him. It was his last gift to me, he said, to make sure I was taken care of. Her voice broke on the last few words. She took a shaky breath, mastering herself before she continued. My father died on a Tuesday. I buried him on a Friday. The following Monday, I walked into a board meeting to find that Julian had spent the weekend finalizing a leveraged buyout of Washington Global. He was using my own inheritance to sell my father's life's work, piece by piece, to our biggest competitors. He had a consortium of investors lined up. He stood to make billions from the destruction of everything my father had built. The betrayal was so audacious, so complete, that Pascal felt a knot of anger tighten in his own stomach. I confronted him, she whispered, her gaze distant, lost in the memory. Right here, in this city, in a penthouse suite, not so different from yours. I begged him. I pleaded. I asked him how he could do it. And he just smiled. That perfect, empty smile. She looked up at Pascal, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He told me the performance was over. He said my father's sentimentality and my bleeding heart were liabilities. And then he said the thing that broke me. He said, my darling Debby, you were always so much more appealing when you weren't in charge. Pascal's blood ran cold. The echo was sickening, born to be on their knees. It was the same sentiment, the same worldview, wrapped in a different package. One was the cold calculation of a sociopath. The other was the thoughtless cruelty of a privileged fool. But both came from the same dark place. The belief that a woman's power was an inconvenience. He thought I was just a poet-loving heiress, she said, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. He forgot my father didn't just teach me philanthropy. He taught me strategy. While he was busy charming investors, I spent the next 48 hours on the phone with the one person my father trusted more than anyone, our family's lawyer, a brilliant, ruthless woman my father called his bulldog. We found a loophole, a tiny clause in the corporate charter tied to the philanthropic foundation. My foundation. I called an emergency shareholders meeting. I walked in, and I didn't plead. I didn't beg. I executed the clause. It froze every asset. It blocked the sale. It checkmated him. He lost everything. His investors, his reputation, all of it. I destroyed him quietly, legally, and completely. She stood up, pacing the small garden space. And in the end, I was left with all of it. The money, the company, the power. And I hated it. I hated what it had done, what it had attracted. That money was a magnet for men like Julian. That power was a threat. So I ran. I handed the reins of the company to a trusted board. I kept the foundation, which I could run from anywhere, and I disappeared. I took a new name, a new life. I wanted to be someone who was valued for the work of their hands, not the number in their bank account. I wanted to be on my knees, scrubbing a floor, because it was honest work. It was real. And for 4 years, it was peace. Until tonight. Until you. The garden was silent again. The story laid bare between them. It was a confession, an explanation, and an indictment, all at once. Pascal felt as though he had been stripped bare himself. His own problems, the pressure from his mother, the weight of his legacy felt like trivial complaints next to the sheer scale of her betrayal and her resilience. He saw his own life with a sudden, brutal clarity. He, too, was playing a role. The dutiful son, the powerful CEO. He had a loving fiancée, a woman his mother had practically hand-picked, a perfect society match who understood the brand but not the man. His entire existence was a performance, just as Debby had said. He was just another monster, one who had mistaken a queen in disguise for a pawn. He walked over to the balustrade, standing beside her, but not looking at her. He stared down at the river of headlights, flowing along the avenues below. "My prison is different," he said, the words coming out rough, unpracticed. He had never admitted this to anyone, not even himself. "It's not one I ran from. It's one I was born into and never learned how to leave." He told her about his father, a man who saw his son not as a person, but as a successor. He spoke of his own dreams, long since abandoned, of being an architect. He wanted to build things with his hands, real things, not just financial empires. He confessed the suffocating loneliness of being surrounded by people who only saw his name, his status, his wallet. "My engagement to Amelia. It's more of a merger than a marriage," he admitted, the truth tasting bitter on his tongue. "It makes my mother happy. It's good for the brand. We look good in photos." He let out a humorless laugh. "I spend my life in rooms just like that one downstairs, surrounded by hundreds of people, and I've never felt more alone." He finally turned to look at her. "When I saw you tonight in the hallway, I wasn't just looking at a maid. I was looking at someone who was doing real work, who was focused, who was quiet. And I think, on some level, I resented you for it. For having a piece I couldn't find." He shook his head, the shame washing over him again. "And then I said that horrible thing. It was for my mother. A stupid, weak attempt to sound like the man she wants me to be. The man in charge." In the dim light, their stories intertwined. The woman who ran from her power, and the man who was suffocating under his. The heiress who became a maid to feel real, and the billionaire who had never felt real in his life. The masks were gone, stripped away by public humiliation and a raw, midnight confession. Debby looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see the arrogant billionaire who had wounded her. She saw the prisoner inside the penthouse. She saw the lonely man who dreamt of being an architect. She saw a flicker of the person he might have been if he hadn't been born a son of Anderson Corps. She saw a fellow monster trapped in a different kind of cage. And a fragile, terrifying thought entered her mind. Perhaps two monsters, caged side by side, could offer each other a strange kind of comfort. The confession hung in the air, a fragile bridge built between two isolated islands. The rooftop garden, once a stage for confrontation, had transformed into a shared sanctuary. The city below still pulsed with a frantic energy, the news cycle churning their names into a global phenomenon. But up here, a strange and profound stillness had settled over them. Pascal ran a hand through his hair, the gesture no longer one of stress, but of weary resignation. So, there it is. The two most envied people in the city, and were both just frauds. A small, genuine smile touched Debby's lips for the first time that night. It was a faint, hesitant thing, but it reached her eyes, softening the sorrow that had lived there. "Maybe not frauds," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "Maybe just, well, camouflaged." The tension between them had finally, fully dissolved, replaced by a tentative, shared vulnerability. They were no longer the billionaire and the maid, or the accuser and the accused. They were just Pascal and Debby, two people who had seen the ugly, hidden truths behind each other's facades. "I'm cold," she said simply, rubbing her arms. The adrenaline and anger had long since worn off, leaving her shivering in the crisp night air. Without a word, Pascal shrugged off his tuxedo jacket. The gesture was instinctual, a simple act of human kindness that felt more genuine than any of the multi-million-dollar philanthropic checks he had ever signed. He draped it over her shoulders. It was warm from his body heat and smelled faintly of starch and his own subtle cologne. The fabric was exquisitely soft, a world away from the coarse material of her uniform. She pulled it tighter around herself, a silent acceptance of the truce and the comfort he was offering. "Thank you," she murmured. They stood in a comfortable silence for a few moments, the shared quiet a conversation in itself. "So what now?" Pascal asked, his voice low. "You can't go back to, you know." "No," she said, looking at the jacket that was now wrapped around her. "The ghost is gone. I suppose Debby Washington has to figure out how to live in the world again." The thought was daunting, terrifying. "And me?" he said, a note of dark humor in his voice. "I get to face the wrath of Beatrice Anderson and try to explain to the world that I am not, in fact, the world's most arrogant, out-of-touch monster." "You have your work cut out for you," she said, the corner of her mouth twitching again. A sudden, jarring noise made them both jump. It was the growl of a stomach. Debby's. A flush of embarrassment rose to her cheeks. "Sorry, I missed dinner." Pascal looked at her, and a real, unforced smile broke across his face. It transformed him, chasing the shadows from his eyes and revealing a glimpse of the man who wanted to go bowling. "I think I know where to find the best food in this hotel," he said. "And it's not in the ballroom." He led her away from the garden, back down the maintenance stairs, and into the quiet, fluorescent, lit arteries of the hotel. He seemed to know his way, a man rediscovering a forgotten part of his own territory. He led her to the main staff cafeteria in the sub-basement. It was empty at this hour, the tables wiped down, the chairs stacked. But the lights were on, and the industrial-sized coffee machine was still humming. "The night shift gets coffee from here," he explained. "And there's a vending machine that the head chef stocks with leftovers for the staff. It's better than anything they're serving upstairs." He strode over to a large, gleaming machine in the corner. Inside were not bags of chips and candy bars, but neatly packaged containers of gourmet food, truffle mac and cheese, slices of prime rib, miniature core me bar LEs. He pulled a crumpled $20 bill from his pocket, a bill he probably hadn't personally handled in years, and fed it into the machine. A few minutes later, they were sitting across from each other at a simple formica table, sharing a container of surprisingly delicious mac and cheese with plastic forks. He had poured them both a coffee in thick ceramic mugs that said Grand Sequoia Staff. The coffee was strong and slightly bitter, a world away from the delicate espressos served in the penthouse. It was perfect. "Tell me about being an architect," Debby said, her voice gentle. Pascal looked startled, as if he'd forgotten his own confession. He stirred his coffee, his gaze distant. "It's all I ever wanted to do. I loved the idea of creating spaces. Places where people could live, work, feel safe. I was good at it. I got into the best schools." He shrugged. "But then my father had his first heart attack. And the narrative changed. It wasn't about my dreams anymore. It was about my duty. About preserving the Anderson legacy. Building a company, not a building. Do you ever draw anymore?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, there's no time. And what's the point?" "The point," she said softly. "The part that isn't the CEO. The part that's real." He looked up at her, at the earnest, intelligent light in her eyes. He felt seen in a way he never had before. Not by his mother, not by his fiancée, not by his board of directors. Amelia, his fiancée, knew he'd once wanted to be an architect. She thought it was a charming little hobby he'd wisely outgrown. Debby understood it was a piece of his soul. "What about you?" he asked, turning the question back on her. "What's the real part of you? Part that isn't the $87 billion heiress or the maid?" She thought for a moment, a forkful of pasta halfway to her mouth. "The garden," she said finally. "My father and I, we had a greenhouse. It was my job to take care of the orchids. They're fussy, demanding. They need the perfect balance of light and humidity and patience. You can't force them to bloom. You just have to create the right environment and wait. And when they finally open up, it's a miracle, every time." Her eyes grew soft with the memory. "I miss that. Creating a space for something beautiful to grow." They talked for hours, it seemed. Or maybe it was only minutes. Time had lost its meaning in the quiet bubble of the cafeteria. They talked about books, about terrible first dates, about the crushing loneliness of a crowd. He made her laugh, a real throaty laugh, when he told her about the time he'd tried to use a washing machine himself and flooded his entire penthouse laundry room. She made him smile when she described the intricate social hierarchy of the hotel's housekeeping staff. For the first time in years, they were not their names. They were not their net worth. They were just two people sharing bad coffee and leftover mac and cheese in the basement of a hotel that had, in one night, become both their prison and their sanctuary. A fragile, unlikely bond was forming in the space between them, woven from shared secrets and the quiet recognition of the prisoner in each other's eyes. As the first hint of dawn began to soften the dark city sky, visible through a high basement window, a comfortable silence fell between them again. Pascal looked at her, at the way the faint light caught the side of her face, the way she cradled the warm coffee mug in her hands. She looked peaceful. "Debby," he said, the name feeling natural on his lips for the first time. She looked up. "Pascal," she replied, her voice equally soft. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he didn't want this night to end. He didn't want to go back upstairs to his life, to Amelia. He wanted to stay here, in this quiet, honest space, with this woman who had seen the worst of him and had somehow, inexplicably, shown him a glimpse of his best. The fragile, tentative connection between them was no longer just about shared trauma. It was blossoming into something else, something warm and hopeful and terrifyingly real. It felt like, after years of winter, a single determined orchid was threatening to bloom in the most unexpected of places. The quiet sanctuary they had built in the hotel's underbelly could not last. The world outside and the storm they had created was waiting. As the sun rose, casting long, pale fingers of light across the city, the reality of their situation came crashing back in. Their fragile truce, born in the dark, was about to be tested by the harsh light of day. Pascal's phone, which he had silenced and ignored for hours, began to buzz incessantly on the table. It was a frantic summons from his mother. Reality was calling. "I have to go," he said, the words feeling like a betrayal of the peace they had found. "They'll be sending a search party soon." "I know," Debby said, pulling his jacket a little tighter around her shoulders, as if it could shield her from what was coming. The magic of the night was receding, leaving behind a cold knot of anxiety. "Listen," he said, his voice urgent, leaning across the table. "Don't go anywhere. Don't talk to anyone. Let me handle this. Let me handle my mother. I'm going to make a statement. I'm going to set the record straight. I promise." His sincerity was palpable. For the first time, Debby allowed herself a sliver of hope, a dangerous, fragile thing. She had spent 4 years trusting no one, and in the space of a single night, this man who had humiliated her had somehow earned a measure of her trust. She looked into his eyes, the same eyes that had once dismissed her, and saw a man who was desperate to be better. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll wait. I'll be in the rooftop garden." He reached across the table, and his hand briefly covered hers. The touch was electric, a jolt of connection that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I'll come and find you," he promised. Then he was gone, leaving his jacket, a tangible piece of their shared night, wrapped around her. As he ascended in the staff elevator, Pascal felt a sense of resolve he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just going to apologize. He was going to tell the truth. About his own words, about Debby, about the culture of casual cruelty his family embodied. It was the first step toward becoming the man he had glimpsed in the basement, the man Debby had seen in him. He stepped out into the penthouse suite and into the eye of the hurricane. Beatrice was there, along with Clara and 2 stone-faced men in dark suits, the family's crisis management team. The air was thick with tension and the smell of scorched earth. "There you are," Beatrice snapped, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. "Your little disappearing act is over. We have a strategy." "I have a strategy, Mother," Pascal countered, his voice steady. "It's called telling the truth. I'm going to hold a press conference, and I'm going to apologize for what I said." Beatrice laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Don't be a fool, Pascal. We don't apologize. We attack. We've already been hard at work." One of the crisis managers, a man with cold, dead eyes, named Mr. Thorne, slid a tablet across the marble coffee table. On the screen was the homepage of a notorious online tabloid. The headline, in huge, screaming letters, was "The Billion-Dollar Greet Inside Debby Washington's Plot to Destroy the Andersons." Pascal's blood ran cold. He snatched up the tablet and began to read. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination, a toxic cocktail of half-truths and outright lies. It painted Debby as a manipulative, mentally unstable woman who, bitter after her fiancé's betrayal, had spent 4 years meticulously plotting her revenge. It claimed she had targeted the Andersons, embedding herself as a maid to manufacture a public confrontation and manipulate the stock market. It was vicious, brilliant, and utterly devastating. But it was the quote that made him feel physically ill. There, attributed to an anonymous source, close to the family, was a twisted, self-serving version of his own words. Pascal was the real victim here, the source claimed. He saw a woman on her knees, who seemed distressed, and he merely commented to his mother that some people are unfortunately forced into such positions in life. He was expressing sympathy. Miss Washington twisted his words of pity into an attack for her own sick game. He looked up from the screen, his face pale with disgust. "Who did this?" he whispered, though he already knew the answer. "We did what was necessary," Beatrice said, her chin held high. "We are protecting this family. We are protecting your legacy." "My legacy?" he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "By turning me into a liar and destroying an innocent woman? This isn't protection. This is poison." "She is not an innocent woman," Clara chimed in. "She's the enemy. And you, Pascal, you need to decide you're on." He felt the walls of his life closing in, the weight of his family, his name, the entire Anderson empire, was pressing down on him. The resolve he'd felt in the basement began to fracture under the immense, familiar pressure. "A reporter from the Times is waiting for a comment downstairs," Mr. Thorne said, his voice flat. "We've arranged an exclusive. All you have to do is express your shock and dismay at Ms. Washington's manipulative actions. Confirm your pity for her situation. The narrative is set. You just have to play your part. Play his part." The words echoed Debby's from the garden. "Everyone is playing a role." He looked at his mother's unyielding face, at the web of lies they had spun, and he felt a wave of helpless despair wash over him. To defy them now would be to declare war on his own family, to torch the entire life he knew. Courage he'd felt just moments ago seemed like a distant memory. Debby waited in the rooftop garden as the sun climbed higher, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the city. Pascal's jacket was still around her shoulders, a fading reminder of the warmth and hope of the previous hours. She paced the gravel path, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach with every passing minute. A junior hotel staffer, a young man with a nervous expression, finally found her. "Miss Washington, there's a reporter here to see you." Chen from the New York Times. She said she just spoke with Mr. Anderson and wanted your response." Debby's heart leaped. Pascal had done it. He'd given his statement. She followed the young man down to a small, private meeting room the hotel had set up for her. The reporter, a sharp woman in her 40s with intelligent, questioning eyes, stood as Debby entered. "Missy Washington, thank you for seeing me. I've just come from a preliminary conversation with Pascal Anderson." "And?" Debby asked, her breath held. The reporter's expression was one of professional sympathy. He expressed his profound shock and disappointment at what he calls your calculated and cruel public ambush. He stated that his words were twisted and taken out of context, and that he feels like a victim in this situation. He's expected to release a full statement to that effect later today. She paused, her eyes searching Debby's face. "Do you have a response to that?" The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from Debby's lungs, leaving a vacuum of pure, cold shock. "Victim," twisted his words. It wasn't possible. Not after their conversation. Not after the coffee and the confession and the promise. But the reporter's words were a death knell to the fragile trust she had allowed to grow. She saw it all with horrifying clarity. The man in the basement was the performance. The dutiful son, the corporate shark that was the real Pascal Anderson. He had played her. He had mined her for her story, for her vulnerability, and then used it to build his own defense. The shared loneliness, the tentative connection, it had all been a lie. A strategy. She felt a pain sharper and more profound than Julian's betrayal. Julian had been a monster she hadn't seen coming. Pascal was a monster she had seen, forgiven, and foolishly begun to trust. The humiliation she had felt on her knees in the hallway was nothing compared to the gut-wrenching devastation she felt now. She looked at the reporter, her face becoming an emotionless mask. The warmth, the hope, the vulnerability, it all vanished, locked away in a deep, cold vault. The avenging angel on the stage was gone. The quiet, hopeful woman from the basement was gone. All that was left was ice. "No," she said, her voice flat and dead. "I have no response." She turned and walked out of the room. She walked back up to the rooftop garden, the reporter's words echoing in her head. She shrugged off Pascal's jacket, the lingering warmth now feeling like a sickening mockery. She folded it neatly, just as she would fold a hotel sheet, and placed it on the stone bench where they had talked. She had made the gravest mistake of all. She had let her guard down. She had allowed herself to believe that a man like that could change, that a connection born in conflict could be real. She had believed in a miracle orchid blooming in a wasteland. The bond between them hadn't just been tested. It had been systematically, brutally shattered. And as she looked out over the city, Debby Washington made a new vow. She would never, ever make that mistake again. The penthouse suite should have felt like a victory war room. The narrative had been successfully flipped. The Anderson name, though bruised, was now cast in the role of the victim. Mr. Thorne was fielding calls, his voice a calm, steady drone of strategic denial. Beatrice was already planning a family recovery interview with a friendly television host. Claire was gleefully reading supportive comments from their social circle online. But for Pascal, the air was thick with the suffocating stench of his own failure. He stood by the window, a prisoner once again, watching the city move on below, oblivious to the war that had been fought and lost within him. He hadn't spoken the words himself, not directly to the reporter. He had hesitated. Faced with his mother's iron will and Thorne's cold logic, he had faltered. He hadn't explicitly confirmed the lie, but he hadn't denied it either. His silence, his weak, cowardly hesitation, had been his consent. He had allowed them to speak for him, and in doing so, he had betrayed the one moment of genuine connection he had felt in years. He could still feel the warmth of the staff cafeteria, hear the sound of Debby's laughter. He could see the trust in her eyes when he'd promised to make things right. And he had crushed it. He had taken that fragile, tentative trust and allowed his family to grind it into dust. "The board is pleased," Beatrice said, walking over to him, her voice laced with triumph. "They're issuing the statement of full support. We've weathered the storm." "We didn't weather it," Pascal said, his voice hollow. He finally turned from the window to face her. "We just became it. We became the liars, the manipulators. We became everything she accused us of being. We did what was necessary for survival. Something that woman with her bleeding heart theatrics will never understand." In that moment, Pascal saw the truth with a blinding, painful clarity. This wasn't about survival. It was about pride. It was about an obsession with image over integrity, with power over people. He looked at his mother, at the woman who had molded him, and he realized he was at a precipice. He could continue down this path, becoming a hollowed-out vessel for his family's ambition, forever playing the part they had written for him. Or he could choose something else. He thought of Debby. He imagined her hearing the news report, the reporter's professional voice relaying his betrayal. He pictured the hope in her eyes dying, replaced by that familiar guarded pain. He saw her folding his jacket, the last symbol of their connection, and placing it on that cold stone bench. The image was a physical blow. It was the image of him becoming no better than Julian, another monster who had wounded her. And he couldn't live with that. He couldn't be that man. The choice crystallized in his mind. It wasn't a choice between his family and Debby. It was a choice between the man he was supposed to be and the man he wanted to be. It was a choice between his inheritance and his soul. "No more," he said, his voice quiet but ringing with a newfound, unshakable authority. "I'm done." He walked past his mother, ignoring her sharp, questioning call of his name. "Cancel the statement," he said. Thorne looked up, a flicker of annoyance in his dead eyes. "Mr. Anderson, the strategy is working." "I said, cancel it," Pascal repeated, his voice dropping to a command. "And call a real press conference. Downstairs. In the main lobby. In 1 hour. No pre-approved questions. I'll be making a new statement. My own statement." "Pascal, what are you doing?" Beatrice demanded, her voice rising in panic. He turned to her, his expression calm, resolute. The fear was gone. The hesitation was gone. All that was left was a man who had finally made a decision. "I'm choosing," he said simply. "I'm choosing to be the man my father should have raised, not the CEO he wanted. I'm choosing to tell the truth." He looked from his mother to his sister. "And if this family and this company is built on a foundation of lies, then it deserves to crumble." He walked out of the room, leaving a stunned, horrified silence in his wake. He didn't take the staff elevator this time. He took the grand glass elevator in the main lobby, descending in full view of the world, ready to face the consequences of his own reckoning. Debby had retreated to the only place that still felt like a sanctuary, her old locker room. She had retrieved her few personal belongings, the worn copy of Whitman, a faded photo of her father, a spare sweater. She was preparing to leave, to finally walk out of the Grand Sequoia and never look back. She would call her lawyers, her board. She would re-engage with her life, not out of desire, but out of a cold necessity. The world was full of monsters. The only way to survive was to be stronger, colder, and more powerful than all of them. The brief, warm interlude with Pascal had been a dangerous fantasy, and she was now awake and clear-eyed. Her phone, a simple, untraceable burner she'd used for 4 years, buzzed with a text from the only person who knew where she was, the hotel's general manager, a kind man who had respected her privacy. The text was simple. "You should turn on the news. Any channel. Right now." A sense of dread washed over her. What now? Another fabricated story? Another attack? With a weary sigh, she walked to the staff lounge, where a television was always murmuring in the corner. A crowd of hotel employees, chefs, bellhops, housekeepers who had been her colleagues was gathered, their eyes glued to the screen. And there he was, Pascal Anderson, standing at a hastily assembled podium in the hotel's main lobby, the very heart of the media storm. He wasn't flanked by his mother or by slick crisis managers. He was alone. He looked pale and tired, but his posture was straight, his gaze direct. He looked nothing like the preening heir from the night before, nor the weak, broken man she imagined had betrayed her. He looked free. He leaned into the microphones, and a hush fell over the room, both in the lobby on the screen and in the staff lounge around Debby. "My name is Pascal Anderson," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Last night, I said something cruel, arrogant, and unforgivable to a woman who was doing her job with a dignity I can only now begin to appreciate. There is no context that can excuse it. There is no spin that can justify it. It was a failure of character, and I am solely responsible. Debbie's breath caught in her throat. The employees around her murmured in shock. The statements released to the press this morning, attributed to sources close to my family, are a fabrication, he continued, his voice gaining strength. They are a cowardly and shameful attempt to malign Maid. Debby Washington, a woman of extraordinary strength and integrity. She is not a manipulator. She is not a grifter. She is the victim of my cruelty and my family's subsequent deceit. The truth is, she held up a mirror to me, and I was horrified by the man I saw. He paused, taking a deep breath. This was it. The point of no return. Effective immediately, I am resigning as CEO of Anderson Corp. I am also divesting my entire personal inheritance and placing it into a blind trust, the proceeds of which will be administered by the Washington Foundation, to be used for causes that promote social and economic justice, causes that might, in some small way, begin to repair the damage my privilege and ignorance have caused. Gasps rippled through the lobby on the screen. Debby felt her knees go weak, and she gripped the back of a chair for support. He was giving it all up. The money, the power, everything she had run from. He was willingly sacrificing it. My family's name, my inheritance. These are not things I earned, Pascal said, his eyes finding the camera as if he were speaking directly to her. They are things I was given. And I have learned in the last 12 hours that a person's real worth has nothing to do with what they are given. It has everything to do with what they are willing to stand for. I cannot undo the hurt I have caused, but I can refuse to continue living a lie. I apologize, sincerely and without reservation, to Mrs. Washington. She deserved my respect. Instead, she received my arrogance. I hope that, one day, she will be able to forgive me. He looked down for a moment, then back at the cameras, his face etched with a painful, beautiful honesty. I am no longer the CEO of Anderson Corp. I am no longer an heir to a fortune. I am just a man who made a terrible mistake and is now going to try and build a life, a real life, that he can actually be proud of. He stepped back from the podium, ignoring the storm of questions that erupted from the reporters. He just turned and walked away, a lone figure moving against the tide of chaos he had both created and quelled. In the staff lounge, there was a stunned silence, followed by a smattering of applause from her former co-workers. But Debby didn't hear it. She was staring at the screen, at Pascal's retreating back. He hadn't just apologized. He had committed an act of professional and personal self-immolation. He had burned down his entire world, not to save his own reputation, but to salvage his own soul. He had done it for her, for the truth. Tears, hot and unexpected, streamed down her face. They weren't tears of sorrow or anger. They were tears of shock, of awe, of a hope she thought had been extinguished forever. He had chosen. He had chosen integrity. He had chosen truth. He had chosen her. And now she had a choice to make too. She could walk out that door, back to her safe, lonely, powerful life. Or she could walk toward the man who had just proven he was worth more than his entire bloodline. A man who was now, for the first time, truly free. Pascal didn't go back up to the penthouse. He walked out the main doors of the Grand Sequoia Hotel, past the stunned reporters and the flashing cameras, and into the raw, noisy embrace of New York City. He had no security detail, no limousine waiting. For the first time in his life, He was just a man on a sidewalk. The feeling was terrifying and utterly, breathtakingly liberating. He didn't have a destination. He just walked, letting the rhythm of the city seep into his bones. He had torched his past, his present, and his future in one 5-minute speech. He had no job, no inheritance, and he had alienated the only family he had ever known. He had nothing left but the clothes on his back and the strange, unsettling peace that came with having finally told the truth. He walked for blocks, ending up, as if by some unconscious homing instinct, at the entrance to Central Park. He found an empty bench and sat down, watching the world go by. Tourists with maps, nannies with strollers, couples holding hands. He felt like a foreigner in his own city, a ghost observing a life he was no longer a part of. He had made his grand gesture. He had apologized, but he had no right to expect forgiveness. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with the consequences alone. He thought of Debby. He hoped she had seen it. He hoped she knew he wasn't the coward she must have thought him to be. That was all he could hope for. He closed his eyes, the afternoon sun warm on his face, and for the first time since he was a boy dreaming of blueprints and steel beams, he felt a flicker of quiet optimisms for whatever came next. He had nothing, which meant he could finally build anything. He heard a soft footstep on the pavement in front of him and opened his eyes. She was standing there. Debby. She had changed out of her work clothes and into a simple, elegant black dress. His tuxedo jacket was no longer with her. She looked like the powerful, confident woman she was, but the look in her eyes was not one of judgment or anger. It was soft, questioning, and filled with an emotion he couldn't dare to name. "Quite a speech," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the city's hum. Pascal's heart hammered in his chest. He stood up slowly, facing her. "I meant every word." "I know," she said. "I saw it." She took a step closer. "You gave it all away. The company, the money, everything." "It wasn't mine to keep," he said simply. "Not if it meant living like that. Not if it meant being that man." An easy silence settled between them, a world away from the charged, painful silences of the night before. This one was comfortable, filled with understanding. "My father once told me," Debby said, her gaze drifting to the trees, "that the ultimate measure of a person is not where they stand in moments of comfort and convenience, but where they stand at times of challenge and controversy." She looked back at him, a small, beautiful smile gracing her lips. "I think he would have been very impressed with you today, Mr. Anderson." "Pascal," he corrected her gently. "It's just Pascal now." "Pascal," she repeated, testing the name. "I like it." He took a hesitant step closer to her. All the games were over. All the masks were gone. There was nothing left to hide behind. All he had was the raw, terrifying truth of his feelings. "Debby," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything. Not after what I did. But that night, our conversation, it was the realest thing that has happened to me in my entire adult life. And I was a coward. I let my fear and my family get in the way, and I hurt you. I broke the promise I made to you." "You kept it," she interrupted softly. "It just took you a little longer than I expected." His eyes searched hers, desperate for a sign. Is it too late? To start over, not as a billionaire and an heiress, just as Pascal, the man who wants to build things, and Debby, the woman who loves orchids. Debby's smile widened, and this time it reached her eyes, lighting them up with a warmth that chased away all the shadows of the last 4 years. She thought of the cold, lonely life she had been about to return to, a fortress of wealth designed to keep everyone out. And she looked at the man in front of her, who had just torn down his own fortress for the entire world to see. He hadn't run from his world, he had transformed it. He had faced the monsters, both his family's and his own, and he had won. She remembered the feeling of being on her knees on that cold marble floor, the profound humiliation of being made to feel worthless. And then she looked at the man who was now standing before her, stripped of everything, offering her his most vulnerable, honest self. In an echo of the moment that had started it all, she did something unexpected. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently straightened the collar of his shirt, a gesture of care, of intimacy. It was the inverse of his mother's sharp, controlling tugs on his bow tie. "I was wrong," she said, her voice a near whisper. "My issue wasn't that you insulted a maid. It was that I had started to believe that hiding was the only way to be safe." She looked up, her eyes locking with his. "You just showed me how brave you can be out in the open. I think I'd like to try being brave too." Pascal's breath hitched. He reached up and covered her hand with his own, holding it there against his heart. He could feel its steady, rhythmic beat. A heart that was finally his own. "I still have a lot to learn," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears of relief and joy. "And a lot to make up for." "Well," she said, a playful light entering her eyes, "I know a great philanthropic foundation that could use someone with a good head for strategy. And maybe a very good architect to help design the schools we're building." He laughed, a real, unburdened sound of pure happiness. It was the laugh of the man who wanted to go bowling, the laugh of the man who was finally free. They stood there for a long moment, in the heart of Central Park, two people who had been publicly shattered and were now, in private, putting each other back together. The story the world would tell would be about the billionaire who lost it all and the heiress who took him down. But the real story, the one that truly mattered, was about the man and the woman who had found each other not despite their worlds colliding, but because of it. Theirs was a love born from the ashes of a public execution, a connection forged in the fires of truth. Hand in hand, they turned and walked deeper into the park, away from the noise and the city, toward a future they would build together. A future that wasn't about legacy or inheritance, but about honest work, quiet gardens, and the simple, miraculous courage to be seen for who you truly are. It was a love story that started with a woman on her knees, but it would be a life they would build standing tall, side by side, equals in every way that mattered. Unexpectedly, and against all odds, it was love at last. Pascal made a huge sacrifice to prove his integrity and win back Debby's trust. What do you think is the most important element for a second chance to work in any relationship, be it romantic or otherwise? Is it a grand gesture, a consistent change in behavior, or something else entirely? I would be so grateful to read your wisdom on this in the comments. Thank you for sharing this journey with me today.